Hello and welcome back to the CS128 video. In today's lesson video, we're going to be talking about functions, comments, and compound data types. So what are functions? Functions in Rust are pretty similar to other functions, right? So if we look at these functions in Java, you'll see we have some sort of return type, we have a name, we have a couple of inputs, and then inside the function, at the end of the function, we have a return, and then we pass some values back. However, we also can have functions that don't return anything, in which case they have a void return type. Let's take a look at how these are done in Rust now. So in Rust, we have fn, which is basically the function declarator. And then just like in Java, you have the name. Now, here's where things get a little bit different. You have, instead of your type then your name for input variables, you have the name and then the type. Right? So in this case, we have A and B, which are I32 types. And then over here, you have the return type. So the return type moved from all the way over to the left to basically all the way over to the right. So in this case, you can see we have an I32 that we're returning, and we basically just add A and B, which are also I32s, and that's this function, right? Not too different from Java, but it's still worth noting. Now, something also to notice is that this return can actually be removed. So if we wanted to, we can just do return by simply putting two values together and no other statement to it, right? Now, it's always nice to have that return because it ensures that you're doing the right thing. But if you feel lazy, you can also omit the return statement. So now looking at this code right here, we have a little bit of a more complex function. Right, we have hello world v2, which is a void function, which when we call it is going to print out hello students, and then we create a couple of numbers, and then we call a couple of add functions, right? Each one does it a different way by simply either having the return statement or not, right? And so they add the numbers 120 and 8 to get 128, and so when we run this, it'll say hello students, and then 128 twice. So let's talk about comments. So in Rust, comments are done by putting two consecutive slashes right next to each other, just like in Java and C++. One thing to note though is that in Rust, these comments, when on multiple lines, are always going to be preceded by two slashes. You can't do something like /* to do a multi-line comment in Rust. That's just not how Rust is built. It would rather you just have multiple slashes for every line. And so just keep that in mind whenever you're writing comments, that if you want to do multiple lines, you need to use slashes. Now, at this point, I'm going to take a little bit of a sidebar from our core content and talk about self-documenting code, because this is a really important part in becoming a programmer, because it determines whether you have to write a lot of comments or if people will just not understand your code at all. So what is self-documenting code? It's code that's inherently readable just by looking at it, right? And so it doesn't mean that you shouldn't write comments. It means that you should make your code easy enough to understand that someone doesn't need comments to understand it. However, you should, while you're striving for self-documented code, also be aware that if you are writing something that is still too complex, you should be writing documentation and other comments, right? And you'll see this in our code as the semester goes on. The comments that we're writing right now will suddenly, slowly but surely get removed, and it'll be only comments for the more difficult functions where you might not know what's going on. All right, so let's talk about compound data types. So compound types are types where you have multiple scalar types in them. So the first example of this is a tuple. And so a tuple is a compound type that can hold several values in a single variable and are created by using comma-separated lists with parentheses surrounding them. One thing that's really important with tuples is that they are fixed length. They cannot change in size, and that's just how they're made, right? And so if we look at this example, you have just a tuple where you put a parentheses and then whatever values you want inside. And this is really useful for something like, let's say, a coordinate system where you want to save an x, y, and a z, but you don't want to have them in separate variables because that gets confusing. Well, if you use a tuple, you can do this all in one variable. Now, tuples can also be destructured, which turns their values into variables. So it's the reverse of creating them. And the way you do this is you do let, and then you create the parentheses just as if you were creating a tuple, but instead you put the variable names inside on the left-hand side of the equals, and then you put the tuple on the right-hand side. And so what this will do is it'll allow you to have a, 2, and 42.35 all in separate variables, even though they were originally stored in one tuple. And so if we take a look at this example, you can see we are creating a tuple, we're then separating them out, and then when we print out, you'll see that we get character A, and then integer 2, and then float 42.35. So let's talk about arrays now. So arrays are another compound data type in Rust, and arrays are fixed length, which is different from other programming languages like Python, but similar like other languages like C++. So in a language like Python, you'd be able to just append to that array no problem. In Rust, C++, and many other lower level languages, you can't do that. You have to be very aware of how much memory you have. And the other unique part about arrays is that they can only hold values with the same data type, right? So you can only hold all ints or all chars or all whatever, right? But it must be the same type across the entire array. And so we create arrays by using comma separated lists in square brackets, just like we do with tuples, except instead of the parentheses, it's now a bracket. And finally, we'll cover vectors later in later lectures, which can grow and shrink in size. And so you might see this in C++ first, you might see this here first, but basically vectors are C++ and Rust's way of having arrays that can grow and shrink in size. And so if we look at this code here, this is how you create a couple of arrays. So the first way that you can do it is you can just simply put the array where you need it to be, and then you just have all the values. The second way is to say what type and then how big it should be, and then you can start by filling it up, or you can manually set those values one by one. And then if you want to initialize an array with the same value for everything, all you have to do is what we do for array 3, which is you put the value you want with a semicolon and then how many times you want it. And so if we were to print all 3 of these arrays out, you'll see that we get the alphabet for the first one, we get 1 through 5 in the second, and then we get the cowboy emojis in the third. And so now to access these values in an array, if you don't want to print out the entire array, all you have to do is use the square brackets just like you would in any other language, and this will print it out just fine. However, there is one thing to note, right? While this is going to print out C, what if we try and put 8 in there, right? What if we try and go out of bounds? Well, Rust is safe, but it's not that safe. So this will actually compile, and it will look like it's fine to you, but if you try and run it, it will crash. So be aware that out of bounds index exceptions can still happen in Rust. And then finally, let's talk about some fancy for loops. So in an earlier lesson, we talked about how for loops can be used to iterate over things very, very quickly. In this case, you can see that instead of having to use indexing and all kinds of other stuff, in Rust, what you can do is you can say for and then a variable name in a.iter, and what that means is that you're taking a collection, in this case an array, and creating an iterator to go through all of the elements in that array. You can then print or do whatever else you want to that element, and it creates a much more simple way to iterate over an array. And as you can see here, we go from 10 through 50. So in summary, in this lesson video, we talked about functions and how you can declare and use them in Rust. We also talked about comments and what some good self-documenting code looks like. And then we also talked about compound data types, including tuples and arrays. And that's the lesson. So hopefully you enjoyed this one. The next lesson, we're going to continue talking about some compound data types and then some other stuff with uses, and then I will see you later next week.